What if I told you that the story we thought we understood about the earliest days of the world might be missing entire layers of meaning, hidden timelines and forbidden decisions made in the silence between heaven and earth? The Book of Enoch, preserved in ancient traditions, claims to unveil those moments, revealing how angels entrusted with watching the borders of creation crossed a line that could never be crossed again. But here is the thing, this book was removed from most of the Christian world. Why? Today I begin tracing the shadows of this mysterious text known as Enoch, and I invite you to walk with me through a corridor of ancient fire where the first betrayal in the heavens unfolded and where its echo still trembles beneath our feet. As I write these words, I feel as though I stand once more at the edge of a celestial mountain, the air thin, the light trembling, as though creation itself holds its breath, because the story of the Watchers is not merely a tale of rebellion. It is a battle plan, a revelation of a war older than nations, a war that has wrapped itself around the destiny of every living soul. Genesis speaks quietly of it in the days when the sons of God saw the daughters of men. Genesis 6:1-4 and Jude 1:6 whispers that these beings abandoned their proper dwelling, seized by desire, stepped into enemy territory and chained their fate to darkness. Yet the Book of Enoch opens the veil wider, showing me not simply what happened, but why it mattered that even angels can forfeit their post and with it unleash ruin across the earth. As I followed the lines of the text, I felt the weight of a truth I could not ignore. The Watchers were not created to fall. They were created to guard, to intercede, to protect the fragile order of the world below. They were stationed like sentinels upon the ramparts of heaven, warriors appointed to hold the frontier between the visible and the unseen. But desire is a subtle serpent, and the heart, even the heart of an immortal, can be pierced by longing when vigilance weakens. They saw beauty and traded purpose for passion, forfeiting the place God assigned them, surrendering their ancient authority, and the moment they stepped from their appointed mountain, they stepped out of the light and into the warfare that still stains the human story. And as I traced their descent, I saw a mirror held before my own soul. For who among us has not been tempted to abandon the place entrusted to us, to leave the calling God has given, to chase our own designs? The fall of the Watchers is not simply history. It is warning and prophecy. It is the blueprint of what happens when creation rejects the order of its creator. In the Book of Enoch, these angels plead for mercy, begging the righteous man to intercede for them. But the answer is thunder. The judgment has been sealed. God says they taught violence and corruption. Now they must drink the cup they poured upon the world. And here is where the truth pierces deeper, because this ancient betrayal is not finished. Its pattern repeats in every generation when the world exalts desire above obedience, when humans walk as though they are their own masters, when boundaries are mocked and sacred things are treated as nothing. The echo of the Watchers returns. And so I ask you, as I asked myself when I first stood before this revelation, are you holding the place God has given you, or are you slowly stepping away from the rampart that guards your soul? This is the challenge for today, to remain watchful where they failed to stand firm, where they surrendered to hold the weapon of obedience, where they laid down their purpose. Because if angels could fall through neglect of their calling, then vigilance becomes our greatest warfare and faithfulness our shield. The story begins here. But the deeper descent awaits us. As I journeyed deeper into the ancient vision, the air around me thickened like a veil between realms, as though creation itself trembled with the memory of what happened when the Watchers abandoned their station and the world began to unravel beneath the weight of their rebellion. I felt as if I were walking through the ruins of a forgotten battlefield where the stones still whispered of choices etched into eternity. For the Book of Enoch does not merely recount events, it carries the pulse of heaven, the sorrow of the Most High, and the shock of a universe watching its own guardians step into forbidden paths. When the Watchers descended, they came not as messengers but as intruders, crossing from the sacred height to the dust of earth, bringing with them knowledge never meant for mortal hands, forging alliances in shadows and binding themselves to desires that twisted their purpose. Enoch describes how they approached Mount Hermon, their feet resting on the threshold between realms, pledging themselves to a pact sealed not in righteousness but in defiance. And as they did, the heavens shook, for these beings were once clothed in light, created to guard humanity and guide its earlier steps. Yet now they wrap themselves in darkness, altering the destiny of generations unborn. I saw in the vision that the world changed. The very soil drank violence. The breath of living creatures grew heavy with corruption. The children born from this unholy union, giants towering beyond reason, brought terror and ruin, and their cries reached the throne of God like smoke rising from a battlefield where no innocence remained untouched. Genesis gives only a glimpse of these days, but Enoch unfolds the full weight of it, a world trembling under the burden of teachings never meant to exist, the knowledge of sorcery, the forging of weapons, the crafting of enchantments, the manipulation of nature itself, all poured into humanity, like poison dripping steadily into a river meant to be pure. And as these practices spread, the hearts of humans grew bolder in wickedness until the earth moaned beneath their feet. For even creation knows when order has been shattered and cries out for deliverance. When I stood in the silence of this revelation, I felt the sorrow of heaven wash over me, for the watchers were not lured by ignorance. They chose rebellion knowingly, exchanging their appointed glory for temporary pleasure, their authority for bondage, their light for the shadows of ambition and desire. And it was at this point the angels who remained faithful lifted a cry to God, a cry demanding justice for the violence covering the earth. And in that holy moment, the Most High summoned Enoch, not as a judge, but as a witness, one mortal, chosen to walk into the courtrooms of eternity and deliver a message of irreversible judgment. Imagine it, a man clothed not in power but in humility, ascending into the realm of burning majesty to confront beings once radiant beyond imagination, now trembling before a decree they could not escape for. Jude wrote of them saying they abandoned their proper dwelling, and 2 Peter declared they were cast into chains of gloomy darkness. And as I walked in the echo of this revelation, I understood that the fall of the watchers was more than disobedience. It was the first great fracture in the link between heaven and earth. The faithful angels surrounded Enoch, guiding him through luminous halls where the records of creation glowed like rivers of fire. And I sensed the gravity of the message he carried. The watchers sought forgiveness, pleading that their rebellion be reversed, begging Enoch to intercede. But heaven had already spoken, the decree was sealed. Judgment would fall, because betrayal from those closest to the throne cuts deepest. In that moment, I realized this story is not merely ancient memory. It is a mirror held against our world, for just as humanity once received forbidden knowledge and became intoxicated by its illusions, so too do we live in a generation obsessed with power, control, and self-exaltation, walking the same path that the watchers used to seduce the early world. And as I contemplated this truth, I felt the weight of a spiritual principle pressing into my spirit. When divine boundaries are broken, chaos is born, and wherever humans reject the will of God for the whisper of their own desires, the pattern of the watchers re-emerges not in giants or supernatural beings, but in the corruption of character, the poisoning of culture, the warping of purpose. I saw how these patterns stretched through time, reminding us that the warfare between light and shadow did not end in those ancient days. It continues even now, shaping nations, homes, and the secret chambers of every human soul. The battlefield is not distant. It is here, it is now. For the war the watchers began still seeks ground in the hearts of those who drift from their calling. And as I stood at the edge of this revelation, a question rose like a blade of fire cutting through my thoughts. Where do you stand in this war? Are you guarding the gate God entrusted to you, or are you slowly stepping away, as they did, drawn by desires that promise much, but lead only to ruin? The challenge of this chapter is clear: to remain steadfast, where the watchers fell to stay, in alignment where they broke formation to hold the weapon of obedience, where they surrendered their purpose for fleeting desire. For if beings made of light could lose themselves through neglect of their calling, how much more must we guard our hearts with vigilance? For we who walk in the dust are invited into battles whose outcomes echo through eternity. And so the story deepens and the descent grows darker, yet the path of truth remains open for those who choose to stand in the light. As I advanced further into the shadowed valleys of this ancient revelation, I felt the weight of ages pressing upon my spirit, as though the very memory of creation leaned close to whisper warnings carved into the first stones of history. And the Book of Enoch does not allow the soul to wander as a spectator. It draws the heart into the drama itself, the war between obedience and defiance, the trembling line where angels once stood yet chose to cross. And as I walked deeper into this mystery, a vision rose before me. Unlike any I had witnessed, a valley of trembling mountains wreathed in silent fire where the watchers awaited their sentence. Their forms, once radiant, now dimmed like stars buried beneath storm clouds, their faces etched with the anguish of beings who understood too late the price of their rebellion. For these were not creatures of ignorance. They knew the laws of heaven. Intimately they understood the boundaries of creation, yet still they abandoned their post, driven by desire for the daughters of men and intoxicated by the dream of shaping destiny with their own hands. Enoch describes how they taught humanity the forging of blades, the knowledge of enchantments, the craft of seduction, the reading of signs in stars, never meant to be interpreted by mortal eyes. And as I beheld this truth, I felt as though I walked through a battlefield where the weapons of the enemy had been laid bare. Not steel or flame, but deception, seduction, ambition, knowledge severed from reverence for the watchers. Did not merely sin, they multiplied sin, teaching humanity to pursue mastery without surrender, power without wisdom, and desire without restraint. And as I lingered in that vision, I recalled the words from Genesis that every intention of the human heart had grown continually evil. For corruption is not born in an instant. It grows like roots beneath the soil, taking hold where vigilance has faded. And as the watchers watched their influence spread across the world, their hearts hardened for their rebellion, had carved a wound in creation that reached the threshold of heaven itself. In the Book of Enoch, the faithful angels carry the cries of the earth. Before the throne they speak of bloodshed, of violence, of souls crushed by the teachings of these fallen guardians. And in that moment I felt the atmosphere shift as though I stood before the courtroom of the Eternal One, where every hidden motive trembles before the purity of his gaze. The Most High commanded Enoch to deliver a message to the watchers, a message no mortal would wish to bear, for it carried the thunder of divine justice, the final decree that their petition would not be granted, that they would find no mercy, no deliverance, no reversal of their fate. And as I took in this moment, I understood a truth. As sharp as a blade, choices made against heaven carry consequences that even angels cannot escape. For authority surrendered to darkness becomes a chain heavier than mountains. And the watchers knew this as their sentence was spoken for. Enoch writes that they trembled and their voices fell silent before the decree. I remembered then how they had begged Enoch to plead for them, how they hoped that a man might soften the judgment of God, but the answer returned like lightning from the heights, "You will have no peace." And as I gazed upon this scene, I felt the sorrow of heaven intertwined with the justice of God, for mercy is abundant. But rebellion born of arrogance hardens the soul beyond repentance, and the watchers had crossed that devastating threshold. Yet in this vision I also saw a warning crafted not for angels but for every human heart, for we too are given positions to guard purposes, to uphold boundaries, to protect, and when we abandon them, the enemy gains ground in the territories of our souls. The watchers fell because they traded vigilance for desire. And how many souls even now walk the same path, becoming blind to the war raging around them, convinced that surrender on small things carries no cost until they awaken to find the darkness has already encircled their lives. As I reflected upon this truth, I saw the earth of Noah's age writhing beneath corruption, giants devouring the land, spirits of violence roaming freely, a world drowning not first in water but in wickedness, and God resolved to cleanse the earth, not because he delights in destruction, but because he guards the blueprint of creation with a love fierce and unyielding, a love determined to restore what rebellion seeks to shatter. And as the vision unfolded, I sensed the nearness of a deeper principle, that spiritual warfare is not chaos, but consequence, that the breaking of divine boundaries always summons judgment, and the upholding of those boundaries always summons a light. And as I grappled with this truth, the question rose again within me, like a flame against the dark. What boundaries has God placed upon your life? What calling has he set upon your spirit? And have you remained faithful to it, or have you slowly drifted toward the shadows, as the watchers did, drawn by promises that glow like embers but burn like poison? The challenge of this chapter begins here, to remember that obedience is not restriction but protection, that surrender is not defeat but weaponry, and that vigilance is the shield that guards the soul from the very rebellion that once swallowed angels in ruin. For we stand in a war whose first blows were struck long before our birth, yet whose victories now depend upon our faithfulness. And so the path continues, winding deeper into the story of judgment and mercy, leading us to the next revelation. Waiting in the ancient fire, beyond the trembling echoes of the Watcher's judgment, I found myself drawn into another vision, one that rose like a storm from the depths of creation, stirring the air with a gravity I could feel in my very bones, for the Book of Enoch does not simply recount the fall of angels, it reveals the architecture of divine justice, the unfolding of a sentence that reaches into time, shaping destinies far beyond the age in which it was first spoken. And as the landscape around me shifted, I beheld mountains, formed of radiant stone, their sides glowing like coals beneath the breath of God, and upon them flowed rivers of living fire, weaving through the valleys like burning serpents, illuminating the hidden chambers where the fate of the Watchers was sealed. And in that moment, a host of holy ones gathered, their presence like a thunderhead rising over the horizon, their faces shining with the uncorrupted light of obedience, their wings stirring the air with the authority of those who had remained faithful. And as they moved, the very ground responded, trembling in reverence, for these were not merely servants, they were guardians of the eternal order, keepers of boundaries that preserve the harmony of heaven and earth. And as I beheld their unity, I understood a truth deeper than any judgment. That loyalty is not merely duty, it is worship, and their steadfastness was a declaration that heaven's design cannot be altered by the betrayal of a few. Then the vision carried me downward into the abyss appointed for the rebellious ones, a chasm carved before the foundations of the world, where shadows coil like smoke and silence reigns thicker than iron. The place Jude described as chains of gloomy darkness, and as I approached the rim, I sensed the weight of justice, not cruel, not arbitrary, but precise, exacting, forged from the very nature of the Holy One, whose judgments are rivers of truth that cannot be diverted. Within that abyss, the Watchers stirred their eyes, dimmed their voices, hollow echoes of what they once were, and I felt the sorrow of their loss, for they had not been created for ruin, they had been fashioned for glory, yet here they stood bound. By the very laws they broke, unable to ascend, unable to rest, imprisoned not merely by chains, but by the memory of what they abandoned for rebellion. Always imprisons the rebel long before judgment is pronounced. Enoch writes that these angels looked upon him with despair, pleading for news of a mercy that would never come. And as I gazed upon this moment, I realized why heaven's answer was unyielding. These beings had corrupted not only themselves, of the blueprint of humanity. They introduced perversions into the earth, they magnified violence, they altered the course of nations, and their actions required a cleansing so complete that only the flood could restore what had been twisted beyond recognition. Yet as I lingered upon this truth, I sensed another layer, a warning woven into creation itself. For the abyss was not merely a prison, it was a prophecy, a reminder of what awaits every heart that abandons the boundaries of God for the same darkness that held the Watchers' waits, to claim any soul that trades obedience for desire. The vision shifted again, and I saw the days of Noah not as a distant story, but as a living tapestry spread across the world, humanity swollen with arrogance, violence ruling the earth, like a tyrant, families torn by corruption, cities rising in defiance of heaven, and spirits of wickedness whispering in the hearts of men, fueling the chaos birthed by the teachings of the Watchers. And as I walked through this ancient darkness, I sensed its chilling familiarity for our age. Mirrors their age, nations trembling under division, desires unrestrained, truth drowned beneath deception, and a world celebrating its own rebellion, unaware that it walks the same path that summoned judgment in the days of Noah. Amidst this revelation, a question arose within me, fierce and unrelenting. Who will stand in this generation as Noah stood? Who will resist the tide of chaos and remain faithful when the world mocks obedience? For Noah was not saved because he was perfect. He was saved because he walked with God and remained in the place assigned to him while the world abandoned theirs. The angels who remained faithful watched the unfolding judgment with unwavering resolve, reminding me that heaven never panics. Even when the earth shakes for divine justice is not reaction, it is restoration, a return to order, a cleansing of corruption, a resetting of creation's rhythm. And as I absorbed this truth, I felt a fire ignite within my spirit. For the war we face today is but a continuation of the ancient war once sparked by the Watchers, and every soul is called to choose a side not by words, but by faithfulness to the place God has assigned. Standing at the threshold of the next revelation, I felt the presence of the Most High draw near like a rising sun, preparing to unveil the next chapter, a truth more profound than the fall of angels, the rise of giants, or the floods that washed the earth, a truth concerning the destiny of souls, and the final boundary that separates the path of light from the path of ruin. And with that, the vision opened a doorway into another realm, awaiting my steps. From the stillness that followed the unfolding visions, another realm rose before me, shaped not by earth nor by the heavens as I had known them, but by the breath of the Eternal One, whose presence fills all spaces and yet rests lightly on the faithful. And as I stepped into this domain, the air shimmered with threads of living light, woven together like a tapestry that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of divine intention. For here I perceived not the judgment of the Watchers, nor the ruin of the rebellion, but the secret architecture that undergirds the universe, the blueprint of order inscribed before the dawn of creation. In that radiant expanse, I saw paths stretching outward like rivers of fire flowing from the throne of God, each path representing a calling, a purpose, a place assigned to angels and to humans alike. And as I beheld this design, I understood that every being fashioned by the Creator is given a territory to guard a task, to fulfill a boundary to honor. And when these are abandoned, chaos follows like a wave unleashed upon the shore. It became clear to me why the betrayal of the Watchers shook the foundations of both worlds, for their assignment had been vast. They were appointed to watch the rise of humanity, to guide it gently, to preserve the harmony between the spiritual and the earthly. Yet in forsaking their post, they tore a wound into creation that rippled through ages, stirring powers that should have remained silent. As I walked within this realm, I sensed the nearness of the Holy One. Though his form was hidden, his presence was unmistakable, like the weight of glory pressing against the soul with tenderness and authority, both fierce and gentle. And from that presence came understanding, not through words, but through revelation that unfolded within me like a scroll of flame. I perceive that rebellion is never a single act. It is a progression, a drifting, a slow turning of the heart away from the voice of God. The Watchers did not fall in an instant. They fell in neglect, they fell in desire, they fell in the subtle belief that they could reshape their own destiny without consequence. And as this truth settled upon me, I felt its shadow stretch across human history as well. For every generation repeats the same battle, either choosing to stand firm in the place assigned or drifting toward ruin, one compromise at a time. The vision deepened, and I beheld the spirits born of the union between the Watchers and the daughters of men beings too large for the world. They inhabited creatures of immense strength and insatiable hunger, whose footsteps cracked earth beneath them, and whose voices carried the rage of souls, unanchored by purpose. And as I watched them roam the land, I understood why the flood became inevitable, for their existence embodied the chaos that arises when boundaries are broken, and when creation itself cries for cleansing. Yet within this revelation, another truth emerged, one that burned brighter than judgment. The mercy of God is never absent, even in the midst of devastation, for in the heart of this divine blueprint, I saw rooms filled with light chambers, where faithfulness was stored like treasure, where the obedience of one humble soul could sway the fate of an entire generation. Noah walked in such light, and his faith became a fortress against the rising tide of corruption, proving that even when the world succumbs to darkness, a single life aligned with God can become a weapon of deliverance. As I meditated on this truth, I felt the fire of clarity pierce through me, for the war ignited by the Watchers continues in our age. Though its forms have changed, the battlefield remains the same. The human heart and the territory God has given each soul to guard for the enemy seeks what he has always sought, to lure the appointed ones away from their post, to whisper that the boundaries are necessary, that the calling is optional, that desire is freedom, when in truth desire without surrender is a chain disguised as a dream. in this holy realm. I saw how easily a life can drift when vigilance fades, how the soul begins to slip from its appointed path inch by inch, until one day it awakens far from the place God designed for it. And the warning struck me with solemn force, for the fall of the watchers began the same way, with small cracks in devotion, minor relentings in vigilance, subtle entertainments of forbidden desire, and these tiny shifts opened the gates to a rebellion that reshaped the story of humanity. The revelation pressed upon me a challenge, fierce and unrelenting. Will you guard the place the Creator has given you? Will you remain steadfast where the fallen ones faltered? Will you stand in your appointed territory with a heart anchored in obedience and a spirit wielding the weapons of faith, prayer and surrender? For in this war, neutrality does not exist, and every soul becomes either a watchman upon the walls of light or a wanderer drifting toward the shadows that consumed the watchers. As the vision dissolved, I sensed that a greater unveiling awaited me, a revelation not only of judgment, but of restoration, the promise of how God reclaims what rebellion seeks to destroy, and how the ancient war still shapes the destiny of nations and souls, preparing the world for the day when all boundaries are restored and all creation stands once more in the radiance of divine order. Across the expanse of the fading vision, a new horizon rose before me, carrying with it a heaviness I could feel in my breath, as though creation itself were preparing to unveil a hidden chamber, sealed since the earliest days of the world. And as I moved toward it, the ground shifted beneath my feet, not as earth, but as memory layers of ancient sorrow intertwined with glimmers of divine purpose. And I sensed that what waited within this unfolding was more than judgment. It was the revelation of why the Watchers' fall shook the very spine of humanity, and how their influence continued long after their chains closed around them. In the depths of the revealed realm, I beheld the spirits left behind when those giants, the children of forbidden union, perished. These were towering presences, stripped of form yet steeped in hunger, drifting through the world like shadows, seeking habitation, craving influence, longing to reclaim the dominion their bodies once held. And as I gazed upon them, I understood why violence multiplied in the days after the flood. For though the giants had been destroyed, their spirits remained unbound, restless and malignant, shaping the spiritual landscape of humanity with a subtlety more dangerous than the physical terror they once embodied. Enoch describes these spirits as wandering without peace, forever stirring strife, inciting corruption, whispering in the hearts of men. And as I watched their movements like smoke threading through the cracks of human frailty, I realized that the war ignited by the Watchers did not end in their imprisonment. It simply shifted battlegrounds, moving from the visible realm to the unseen, forging a conflict that would stretch across ages, pressing its weight upon every soul ever born. The revelation deepened, and I saw how these spirits sought to anchor themselves in human weakness, feeding on anger, jealousy, pride and desire, each emotion becoming a doorway through which they could influence kingdoms, stir nations and shape destinies. For though they had no bodies, they possessed cunning. And though they had been judged, their influence continued like an echo of rebellion reverberating through time. As I beheld this truth, a sobering realization dawned within me that humanity often battles not flesh and blood, but the lingering consequences of an ancient defiance, the corrupted offspring of the Watchers striving to reclaim authority by manipulating human hearts, pushing them toward the same path that once lured angels into ruin. For the enemy has always repeated his strategies, knowing that a distracted soul, a drifting heart, a guard lowered for even a moment can open territory to darkness. This vision did not terrify me, it awakened me. For in that moment I sensed how the Most High had woven safeguards into creation, boundaries of protection, anchored in obedience, disciplines of the Spirit, formed as weapons against unseen forces. Prayer as a shield, faith as a fortress, surrender as a sword, and the Word of God as an unbreakable wall, guarding the mind from the whispers of ancient shadows. Walking deeper into the unfolding revelation, I beheld scenes from across generations, moments when these spirits sought to influence empires, corrupt rulers, ignite wars, deceive prophets, distort truth, and tempt the faithful. Yet in each age, God raised witnesses, men and women whose steadfastness pierced the darkness like burning pillars, individuals who, though frail by nature, stood firm in the territory assigned to them, resisting the seduction of rebellion and proving that even the remnants of the watcher's power could not prevail against a heart anchored in God. Then the vision carried me to a mountain wreathed in storm, where I sensed the heaviness of divine grief, for the Most High mourns, not as man mourns, but with a sorrow born of justice and love entwined. And from this place the revelation became sharper, as though the breath of God passed through me, showing how rebellion always begins with the desire to rise higher than the place assigned, how the watchers sought greatness outside the will of the Creator, and how their offspring sought dominion outside the boundaries of righteousness, and how humanity even now risks the same error, pursuing glory without surrender, identity without obedience, and power without the fear of God. A fire stirred in my spirit as I realized the purpose of this unveiling. It was not merely to recount ancient ruin, but to awaken the living to the true shape of the war surrounding them, to open the eyes of those who walk unaware of the currents that tug at their souls, and to remind every believer that the call to stand watch is not optional. It is essential, for the same spirits that roamed the post-flood world still roam today, seeking territory, seeking agreement, seeking souls willing to trade. Their calling for desire and their purpose for illusions of control. And within this understanding, a challenge rose within me, fierce and unwavering. Will you guard the gates of your heart with vigilance? Will you wield the weapons God has placed in your hands? Will you stand where the watchers fell? Will you refuse the whispers that promise freedom? But deliver bondage, for the war is older than nations, and yet its outcome turns on the faithfulness of individuals who choose light over shadow, obedience over rebellion, surrender over pride. As the revelation began to fade, I sensed that the journey was far from complete. Another chamber deeper still awaited me, holding the mystery of divine intervention, the way God steps into history when corruption reaches its pinnacle, and how the ancient war between light and darkness moves toward an appointed conclusion written before the first star was placed in the heavens. Within the growing intensity of these unveilings, a new clarity settled upon my spirit like a mantle placed by unseen hands, urging me forward into the depths of a narrative that stretched far beyond the fall of angels or the wandering spirits of their offspring. For I sensed that the next revelation would carry me toward the threshold where divine intervention intersects human history, illuminating not only why the ancient world trembled under judgment, but how the Most High moves with perfect timing, restoring balance when corruption threatens to overwhelm creation. And as the vision opened, I beheld the world teetering on the edge of collapse, its foundations strained beneath the weight of violence, its breath choked by wickedness, its people intoxicated by the remnants of forbidden knowledge that had seeped through generations since the Watcher's descent. In those days, humanity lived as though the voice of God had faded into silence, choosing desires that dissolve the foundations of righteousness, and building cities rooted in pride rather than reverence, and yet interwoven through this rising darkness. I perceived threads of divine restraint, invisible boundaries placed by the Creator, preventing the world from devouring itself entirely, for even when man forgets Him, the Eternal One remembers His covenant with creation, guarding it with a love fiercer than judgment. As I observed the earth in this condition, I sensed the heavens stirring, preparing to act, for corruption had reached its impasse, and the cries of the innocent rose like smoke before the throne. And in that moment, the Most High summoned His faithful ones to execute the next chapter of His decree, sending them forth like blades of fire, cutting through the fabric of rebellion. For God never intervenes out of impulse, but out of divine order, and what was about to unfold had been written long before the first sin stained the soil. The vision then carried me to Noah, the solitary beacon of righteousness, in a world drowning in transgression. And as I beheld him, I sensed the gravity of his calling, for he was not chosen merely for survival, but for stewardship of the next era of humanity, his obedience forming a bulwark against the corruption that had spread like plague across the land. And as I watched him labor over the ark, his hands carving wood as though carving the future itself, I felt the weight of a truth that still shakes my soul. Obedience is the weapon that reshapes history, more than strength, more than intellect, more than the might of nations. While Noah prepared for deliverance, the Watcher's spirits scattered across the land, stirring unrest, fueling violence, desperate to retain the influence they once wielded. Yet their power waned, for divine judgment was approaching, and no rebellion can withstand the tide of God's decree. In that moment the heavens darkened, not with malice, but with holy resolve. The fountains of the deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven opened, releasing the waters that would cleanse the world. And I witnessed the flood, not as a tale preserved in memory, but as a living judgment, tearing corruption from the heart of the earth, while preserving the seed of righteousness through one man's unwavering faith. Yet even as the waters swallowed the mountains, I sensed an echo of the coming age. For the flood was both a judgment and a prophecy, pointing toward future reckonings when humanity would again approach the brink of darkness, as in the days Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man. And this revelation pierced my spirit, for it showed that the ancient war between light and shadow is not a relic, but a living conflict, moving toward an appointed moment on the stage of history. As the waters receded, another revelation rose before me, revealing that the spirits born of the watchers would continue their restless wandering, influencing kingdoms, stirring false worship, inciting violence, crafting illusions to mimic divine truth, yet always restrained by boundaries God established, ensuring that their influence could test humanity, but never overpower those who stand firmly in Him. In this insight I felt the fierce compassion of the Most High, for He allows the conflict to continue, not to torture His creation, but to refine it, shaping faith that is not fragile but forged in fire, producing souls capable of standing in the radiance of His holiness when all things are restored. As the vision deepened, I saw the rise of future empires, Babylon, Assyria, Greece, Rome, each one touched by the lingering influence of those ancient spirits, each one erecting monuments to human pride, each one echoing the same rebellion that began with the Watchers. Yet in every era God raised voices, men and women, whose faith disrupted the schemes of darkness. Daniel, Esther, Jeremiah, Mary, John, each proving that the blueprint of divine order prevails whenever a single soul surrenders fully to God. While I absorbed these truths, a challenge stirred fiercely within me. For if the flood marked the cleansing of physical corruption, then the ages that followed became a battleground for the corruption of the heart. And the question echoed through my spirit like a bell struck by celestial fire. Will you remain vigilant in a world repeating the errors of the past? Will you guard your territory when deception returns with greater subtlety? Will you stand firm when the spirits born of rebellion attempt to reclaim what they lost in the flood? In the final breath of the vision, I sensed that a deeper unveiling awaited, one that would reveal not merely judgment or intervention, but the cosmic purpose of the ancient conflict itself, the reason why angels fell, why humanity rises and falls, and how the final victory has been written since before time began, awaiting its hour to break upon the world like dawn over a battlefield, restored to peace. Standing at the brink of the next revelation, I felt creation shift around me as though unseen hands were drawing back a veil that had stretched across ages. For the war that began with the Watchers had not been isolated to the ancient world, but had woven itself into the unfolding story of nations shaping ideologies, twisting cultures, whispering through kings and conquerors and prophets alike. And as this awareness washed over me, a new panorama appeared, vast as the horizon itself, revealing the hidden thread connecting the earliest rebellion to the destiny of the world. Before me rose a vast expanse where time moved like a river flowing through valleys of triumph and corridors of ruin. And in this river I saw civilizations rise and fall like waves under the breath of God. Egypt shimmering with pride, Babylon crowned in arrogance, Persia wrapped in ambition, Greece burning with intellect, Rome armored in dominion. Each empire shaped not only by the ambitions of men, but by the invisible pressure of spiritual forces seeking to exert influence through human desire and unbridled pride. I sensed how the lingering spirits born of the Watcher's offspring sought footholds within these nations, exploiting their strengths, corrupting their wisdom, igniting wars, turning kings into instruments of rebellion, and weaving deception into the very laws that governed their people. Yet at the same time I saw the faithfulness of God threading like light through the tapestry, raising His servants precisely when darkness seemed strongest, Moses confronting the might of Egypt, Elijah standing alone before prophets of false fire, Daniel unmoved within the courts of empires that bowed to idols, Esther overturning decrees inspired by hatred. And through each of these moments I discerned a pattern. The Most High permits darkness to rise only to reveal the greater strength of his sovereignty through the obedience of a single surrendered heart. While observing this dance of divine intervention and spiritual resistance, I realized a deeper truth. The war born from the Watchers' rebellion was never merely between angels and demons. It was fought within the choices of humanity, each decision an arrow, either strengthening the kingdom of light or feeding the shadows that sought dominion. And through this understanding, I saw the mercy of God woven even into judgment. For his justice does not emerge from wrath, but from a love determined to prevent creation from collapsing under its own corruption. As the vision deepened further, I perceived the moment when the world entered a silence heavy as a tomb, the 400 years between the last prophet and the dawn of Messiah, a silence not empty but expectant, charged with the sense that heaven was preparing a movement that would shift the course of the war forever, for even the Watchers' rebellion had not anticipated what was coming, the eternal word stepping into flesh, the light entering the battlefield, not with legions, but with humility. In a single breath, the vision carried me to Bethlehem, and I beheld the night when the heavens themselves could not contain their exultation, angels crying out across the sky, declaring peace on earth for the one who would undo the works. Darkness had arrived, not with weapons forged by hands, but with a purity that no corruption could touch, and an authority that no rebellion could withstand. As I watched him walk the roads of Israel, I sensed how every miracle, every teaching, every confrontation with corrupt powers was a strategic strike against the ancient forces that had manipulated humanity since the days of Enoch. For the Messiah did not come merely to redeem, but to reclaim territory stolen long ago, breaking chains forged before the flood, and exposing the spirits that once roamed freely to the judgment written against them. When he commanded unclean spirits to depart, I felt the tremor of ages collapsing, for these were the same entities birthed in the shadow of the Watchers, fall now trembling before the one whose voice shaped creation in the beginning, and with each deliverance I understood how his authority restored boundaries that rebellion had shattered, reminding both angels and men that God had not relinquished his world to darkness. The vision then revealed the cross rising like a pillar against the horizon, a place where heaven and earth collided within the body of the Son. And I saw how the war reached its climax, not through violence, but through sacrifice, for his surrender became the weapon that shattered the claims of the ancient powers, his blood the declaration that the corruption of the Watchers would no longer define the destiny of humanity, and his resurrection the proclamation that the dominion they sought had crumbled to dust under the feet of the risen King. As these truths flooded my spirit, a fierce urgency awakened within me, for the world still walks in the shadow of that ancient rebellion. Nations seduced by pride cultures, shaped by deception, souls drifting from their divine calling, unaware that the war continues. Yet the victory has already been decided, and every believer stands now as a watchman, called to guard the gates of their heart and the territory God has entrusted. Through this understanding, a question formed within me sharp as a blade. Can you recognize the schemes that echo the old rebellion? Do you see how desire still masquerades as freedom, how deception cloaks itself in wisdom, how pride disguises itself as empowerment? And will you stand firm when the ancient spirits return with renewed subtlety, seeking to reclaim influence through distraction, temptation, and the promise of self-exaltation? As the vision dimmed, I sensed another revelation waiting like a hidden chamber beneath the throne of God, a glimpse into the final phase of the ancient war, the culmination of all prophecy, the restoration of creation, and the ultimate judgment of the forces birthed in the Watchers fall, a truth so profound that even the stars seemed to hold their breath as it drew near. Near the threshold of the final unveiling, a silence gathered around me unlike any I had encountered before, dense not with absence, but with anticipation, carrying the sense that creation itself was leaning forward to witness the culmination of a story begun long before the dust of the earth first clung to the feet of humanity. And as this silence enveloped me, the veil parted, revealing a vista vast as eternity, where the ancient war birthed in the rebellion of the Watchers reached toward its conclusion, echoing across ages and converging into a single destiny written by the hand of the Most High. In this sweeping revelation, I saw the rise and fall of empires stretch into the horizon like shadows cast by mountains, while behind them spiritual forces moved with strategic precision, some aligned with the eternal light, others still driven by the defiance born in the days of Enoch. And as these forces clashed in unseen realms, their influence rippled through the world, shaping cultures, steering ideologies, and fueling conflicts that humanity often mistakes for merely political or earthly struggles. As I walked deeper into the unfolding vision, I beheld the nations of the present age vibrating with unrest, their foundations trembling beneath the weight of pride, deception, and spiritual blindness. I saw shadows slithering through, governments stirring confusion, whispering lies that masquerade as enlightenment, urging humanity once again to break the boundaries set by the Creator and rewrite the definitions of truth, righteousness, and purpose. And in those shadows, recognized the same ancient spirits that wandered after the flood, relentless in their desire to reclaim dominion through the hearts of those who drift from the voice of God. Yet intertwined with this rising darkness, I saw a counter-movement luminous as dawn, the people of God awakened from complacency, stirred by the Spirit to take their place as warriors of light, not in violence, but in faith, not in rebellion. But in surrender, their prayers ascended like arrows piercing the clouds, their obedience forming walls of fire that resisted the influence of unseen predators, and their devotion carrying the fragrance of heaven into a world suffocating beneath the weight of its own rebellion. Within this balance of forces, I felt the earth groan as though laboring under the tension of approaching fulfillment. The signs spoke loudly, though few wished to hear. Nations in turmoil, hearts growing cold, truth treated as an enemy. Righteousness mocked while deception was celebrated, and in these patterns I recognized the silhouette of prophecy for the Messiah had spoken of these days, warning that just as in the time of Noah, the world would rush toward corruption, unaware that judgment approached like a tide rising in silence before it breaks upon the shore. The vision deepened, and I beheld scenes that stirred my soul with equal parts sorrow and awe, for I saw humanity on the brink of choices that would shape the destiny of generations, choices between light and shadow, between surrender and self. Exaltation between the voice of the shepherd and the whisper of ancient serpents born of the watcher's lineage. And as I watched men and women struggle beneath the weight of these decisions, I sensed the urgency of this hour, for the war that once raged among angels now reached its crescendo within the hearts of humans, carrying consequences eternal in scope. Then the vision shifted, and I saw thrones radiant with holiness, arranged around the sea of glass, where judgment would be executed upon the fallen forces and the spirits that issued from the watchers, corruption, each one trembling beneath. The weight of justice approaching for this judgment would not be measured in centuries or millennia, but in the perfect timing of the Eternal One, who misses no rebellion and forgets no injustice, yet delays only because of mercy giving space for repentance before the final decree falls. I watched as the books were opened, vast records of choices, actions, and loyalties, and the sense of finality weighed upon me like a river of light, pressing into the marrow of my being. For the war was not merely ending, it was reaching its ordained resolution, restoring creation to its original harmony, and cutting off forever the influence of the Watchers and their offspring, who once sought to redefine the world according to their own corruption. Within this revelation I discerned the figure of the Messiah robed in glory, his presence a blaze that consumed every shadow around him, and the authority that emanated from him shook the very foundations of the vision, for he alone held the power to bind the ancient spirits, to cast them into judgment, to restore the order shattered by their rebellion, and to reign as king over a renewed creation, purified from the stain of chaos and deceit. As his radiance filled the expanse, I felt the truth strike me with overwhelming force that every act of obedience offered by the faithful, even in the smallest moments, contributes to this coming victory. Every prayer, every surrender, every refusal to bow to deception becomes a declaration of allegiance to the kingdom that will outlast the world itself. The final part of the vision held a question forged in fire and placed directly upon my spirit. Will you stand when the world chooses to fall? Will you guard the territory God has entrusted to you as the ancient war nears its end? Will you remains steadfast when deception grows sophisticated and rebellion disguises itself as enlightenment. For the victory is certain, but participation belongs only to those who endure in the light, and the question demands an answer from every soul who hears the echo of this ancient story. As the vision closed, I sensed that the final chapter awaited one that would bring all things together in a revelation of restoration, judgment, and eternal order, completing the story that began with the Watchers and ending in the triumph of the one who reigns forever. Upon reaching the final edge of the revelation, a light rose before me, unlike any I had seen throughout this long journey, a radiance neither gentle nor fierce, but complete, enveloping every fragment of creation with the certainty that the ancient war once sparked by the Watchers' rebellion would not remain a wound forever. For the Most High intends restoration not as a distant dream, but as the culmination of all things. And as this light expanded around me, the fragments of the visions I had witnessed across ages drew together like pieces of a shattered mirror, reassembling into a single truth that burned through my spirit with unmistakable clarity. The corruption born of the Watchers brought ruin. The wandering spirits of their offspring brought torment. The rise of empires brought oppression. The pride of nations brought deception. Yet through it all, the purpose of God moved forward. Unstoppable as a river, carved through stone, shaping history, with a hand both tender and sovereign guiding humanity toward the moment when every shadow would face its final reckoning, and every loyal heart would enter the peace promised since the foundation of the world. In this culmination, I saw the renewal of creation, not through destruction, but through transformation. The heavens cleansed, the earth restored, the nations healed, and the boundaries once shattered by rebellion re-established in perfect order. Under the reign of the Messiah, whose glory filled the expanse like dawn, rising after an age of night, and in his presence every spiritual force that once opposed him bowed in defeat, while every soul who remained faithful shone with the pristine radiance of those who had stood their ground upon the battlefield of the heart. I realized then with piercing clarity that this is the reason the story matters. Not because of fascination with angels or fear of ancient spirits, but because the fall of the Watchers mirrors the choices set before every human soul: obedience or rebellion, surrender or pride, vigilance or drifting, and the destiny of creation itself is woven from the outcomes of those choices. For God has given mankind a role in the war, a calling not to observe, but to stand watch as guardians of the territory entrusted to them. As these truths settled upon me, the light drew closer until it felt as though it wrapped itself around my being like a mantle. And in that embrace, I heard without hearing the unspoken declaration that the war will end not with the triumph of darkness, but with the complete restoration of divine order, a restoration written long before the first star burned and sealed by the blood of the Messiah, who broke the chains forged in the days of Enoch and reclaimed every authority the Watchers sought to corrupt with the revelation. Now complete, a fierce challenge ignited within my spirit, urging me to speak it forth, for the time of drifting has ended and the hour of vigilance has come. And so I ask you, as I asked myself when the visions first began, will you stand firm as the final chapters of this ancient war unfold? Will you guard the gates of your heart against the subtle whispers of rebellion? Will you wield the weapons of prayer, faith, surrender, and obedience with the resolve of a warrior who knows the blueprint of heaven is worth defending? For the victory of God is certain, but the faithfulness of his people is the battlefield on which it manifests. Therefore, let this final truth burn within you like a living fire. You are not born to wander, you are born to watch. You are not called to drift, you are called to stand for. The story that began with the Watchers will end with the triumph of the faithful and the glory of the King who reigns forever.